How's it going, everybody? Dana here with North Central Coins, and welcome to another episode of the most rare and valuable coins in Canada. Today we're going to be discussing Canadian quarters in the date range from 1915 until 1952. So that's the end of the George VI era. All of these quarters are silver. Some of them are sterling silver, some of them are 80%. That doesn't necessarily affect the value. What mostly affects the value in these coins is condition. Condition is everything on these old coins, and some of them, even in a low grade state, are worth buku dollars. So a lot of these early 1900s are super low mintage, and if you can get them in an MS state, they're going to be worth thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. We're going to cover a few varieties today as well. But before I do get into this, I would really appreciate if you guys would hit that thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to see more Canadian coin content just like this. And then without further ado, what do you guys say we get into my top 10 picks for the most rare and valuable coins between 1915 and 1952? Let's get it. So the date range I mentioned I'm going to be covering in this video is going to be from 1915 until 1952. So that is the George V and the George VI era. And the reason that I'm not starting at the beginning of the George V era is because the first few years aren't quite as valuable as the 1915, which I would consider is definitely the key dates of the George V era. And we're going to start it off with the 1915, which has an extremely low mintage of 242,382. So that is one of the lowest mintages that I have seen or heard of in almost all of the Canadian coin denominations post 1900. That is a unicorn for sure. Now, this one can fetch you a pretty good price even in a low quality condition. You can get around $35 for a VG8, which is a pretty well-worn circulated coin. You can get up to $1,750 for an almost uncirculated. So as we go up in the grading tiers, the value starts to increase pretty substantially on these early date coins. You can get yourself around $3,500 for an MS60 and up to $14,000 for an MS64. So if your grandpa hands you down some coins and you find a 1915 in a coin flip and it looks like it's in pretty good shape, I definitely suggest you send that in to be graded, because you could have something that is truly worth a fortune. Now, one thing you might notice in a lot of the quarters that I'm covering today is a lot of them have very low mintages. Even by Canadian standards, usually it's pretty hard to find Canadian coins under $1 million, and when you do, a lot of the time they will have a super high premium. So next up is going to be the 1921, which has a mintage of 597,337. Now, because of this low mintage, it gives it a pretty good premium. Even in a circulated worn condition, it can be worth around $20 for a VG example. You can fetch up to $850 for a almost uncirculated. You can get up to $3,500 for an MS63, and you can fetch up to $1,200 for an MS65. So we'll keep it going with the 1927, which has an even lower mintage than the 1921, minted at 468,096. Now, it can be worth around $45 for a worn VG example. You can get around $750 for an AU. It can be worth around $2,500 for an MS63, and it can be worth all the way up to $7,500 for MS65 examples. Now we're going to skip ahead 6 years to 1934, which has an incredibly low mintage of 384,350. So not too many of the 1934 quarters were struck. It isn't worth too much in a VG condition. You can only get around $10 for it, which is just pretty much around melt price. But the value goes up pretty high as you go up in the grading tiers. It can be worth up around $190 for an almost uncirculated. You can get $800 for an MS63 and up to $6,000 for an MS65. So that is a huge jump in value there between the MS63 and MS65. You're talking more than $5,000 increase there. So next up is going to be a quarter that should come as no surprise to any experienced or seasoned Canadian coin collector, and that is the 1936 with the dot, the bar, or the dot and bar variations. Now, the easiest way to be able to identify this is to be able to locate a small dot in between the two sashes on the ribbon underneath the date 1936. And the easiest way to be able to identify the bar is it's almost like a small die chip or line running in between the two sashes. Now, if you have yourself the 1936 dot, you can fetch yourself around $45 for a VG example, around $850 for an AU, and up to $5,000 for an MS63. Now, there has been a few specimens that have been known to have these errors, and they can go upwards into the six figures. There's one that was known to sell at an auction for $100,000, and in terms of rarity and scarcity, nothing quite really falls into that category like the 1936 dot specimens. Now, for the 1936 bar variation, it's not worth quite as much as the dot, but it can be worth up to $30 for a VG8. You can get up to $300 for an AU example, and you can get yourself up to $1,700 for an MS63. Now, if you don't hear me ringing out any of the values for some of these MS65 coins, the most likely reason is because there aren't any that are attributed to that high of a mint state. The most high-grade state that they have been attributed to is probably an MS63 or MS64. So the highest known grades for the 1936 dot and 1936 bar are both MS63s. Now, another one you can look for is the 1936 with the dot and bar variation. You can get around $100 for a VG8 example, and it can be worth up to $1,000 for an extremely fine example, and there aren't too many that are known or have been found that are attributed higher than that. Alrighty, so we're at about the halfway point for this top 10 list, and we're going to go to the 1938, which is minted at $3,149,245. Now, it is not worth too much in a VG state, only around $9, but it increases in value a little bit as we go up in the grading tiers. It can be worth around $40 for a almost uncirculated, $150 for an MS63, and it can get all the way up to $3,000 if you have an MS66, which is an extremely good looking 1938 if you have one of those. In several of my previous videos, I have talked about the 1947 Canadian coins. There are a whole lot of variations to look for, and the quarter is definitely no exception. Now, I don't want to get too deep into it, but in 1948, the Canadian Mint had troubles getting dies for the reverse, so due to that, what they did is improvise, and instead of actually putting the date on originally, what they did was put a little maple leaf beside the 7 in the date 1947. So there are a couple variations you can look for, the most basic of which is the 1947 without a maple leaf. Now that is minted at $1,524,555. Now, it's not worth too much when it doesn't have a maple leaf or any of the special attributions, but it can be worth a little bit if you have it in a higher grade tier. Now, it can be worth around $8 for a well-worn circulated VG example. You can fetch up to $40 for an AU example, $120 for an MS63, and it can be worth up to $1,200 for an MS65, and that's actually just for the 1947 plain. No maple leaf, no nothing. Now, next up, I'm going to talk to you about the 1947 dot. Now, I'm not too sure exactly how this error came about, but most likely it's a problem with die deterioration, or it's just simply a die chip, but it is super well known for a lot of the Canadian coins in 1947 to have this error. The nickels also have them, I believe, as well, and it usually adds a pretty good premium to them, just like this quarter, because you can fetch around $110 for a VG example. You can get up to $600 for an almost uncirculated, $2,500 for an MS63, and up to $5,000 for an MS64, which I believe is the highest known graded example. And that's a huge jump from MS63 to MS65. That value doubles right there. So that is crazy. All right, next up is going to be another coin that should be no surprise to any of the experienced Canadian coin collectors out there, and that is the 1948, which is another well-known key date for most of the Canadian denominations, and quarters are definitely no exception. It's not quite as low as some of the other denominations like dollars and half dollars, but it is definitely one you should still keep an eye out for, especially if you can get it in an uncirculated condition or mint state. But it doesn't have too much of a premium. It's only worth around $8 in a VG, so just a tad over silver melt. It can be worth around $40 for an almost uncirculated, $150 for an MS63, $550 for an MS65, and you can fetch all the way up to $1,000 for an MS66, which is usually the highest grade tier you'll see the 1948 in. It is pretty scarce and extremely well known and rare, so good luck finding one for MS65 or MS66 that isn't already graded. If you do, send that sucker in. And here we are at the end of this list. Can you believe it? Number 10 on my top 10 list. Now, I don't usually go in any specific order. I don't go from like least to most valuable or most to least. I usually just go through the years and ring them all off and give you as much information as I can. But for the years 1951 and 1952, for Canadian quarters, there are some variations that gravitate around the relief. Though you can probably fetch a pretty penny for most of these different variations if they are in the high MS states, they aren't actually worth too much. There is one that you want to look out for over all of the other ones, and that is going to be the 1951 low relief. Now, it can get a little confusing and tricky even for me with some of these early proof-like strikes. Now, you would think that when you send a proof-like strike in that it would get the designation as PL, but that isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes the mint would actually throw circulation strikes in. So there are some cases where you might send a coin that you think is a circulation strike in and it might come back as a proof-like, and there are some cases where you might send a proof-like coin in and it'll come back with a circulation grade like an MS or an AU or an EF or something like that. It is very confusing with some of these early Canadian proof sets. They had to deal with some serious stumbles, and there was some serious shenanigans in the early days with some of these mintages just being so insanely low. Take the 1991 quarter, for example, minted somewhere around 400,000. You think that the mint would have learned from their lessons in the early 1900s, but then they go and they make a modern gem for us just like that. But I think this is pretty much going to do it for this one, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you find this video helpful. I'm definitely going to be making more videos on Canadian quarters in the future. We have some other good date ranges to cover. We're going to be going back in time. We're going to be going a little forward in time. If you did enjoy this video, please hit that thumbs up. Please subscribe if you have not. If you would like to buy or check out any of my merch, the link should be down below the comment section. We got coin roll mats, t-shirts, hoodies, all sorts of good stuff for the upcoming holidays. So if you have a coin collector that you would like to buy for this Christmas, go give it a little look-see. But I think that's going to be it, guys. So until the next one, peace out and have a good one, y'all.